Good evening and welcome to AgileTO QuickTalk. Tonight, Mike Bowler is our host and he'll be presenting 6 thinking hats. I'd say that slower, it wouldn't come out that way. Before Mike takes over, I just want to go through just a quick few logistics. You're all on mute, and what we're going to do is Mike is going to give his talk for 10 to 15 minutes or a bit longer. What you can do is down below, please don't ask questions in the chat area. Down below, you'll see a Q&A section. If you could select Q&A in the open section and raise your questions there anytime throughout Mike's talk. What's going to happen when Mike is finished, I believe after Mike is finished, Tom will be going through and monitoring the questions and he'll be asking Mike. So ask away. What we're going to do is in the chat, I posted a menti.com link. We want to get some feedback from everybody tonight. So if you could give your feedback before you leave the session, that would be great. So that's it for logistics. There's no breaks. We're just going to go right through. So before we get going, many of you know Mike. For those of you that don't, Mike is a long-time coach and trainer in the Agile space. Mike also has a keen interest in human behavior, psychology, and applied neuroscience. I find that quite interesting. And that's, you know, part of his focus is understanding how people work, both individually and teams. So, Mike, the floor is all yours. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Trish. What we're going to talk about tonight is the 6 thinking hats approach by Edward de Bono. Let me just share what I have here. So the basic idea of this, it's a creativity exercise. The general idea is that we are trying to come up with a different way of looking at the problem. We can all think to ourselves, we've all heard ourselves at some point say, let me put my sales hat on for a moment because we want to look at this from a different perspective. Or let me put my customer hat on. And so we already understand the notion of putting a hat on to give us a different perspective of what we're trying to do. De Bono calls it 6 specific hats. And when we wear each hat, we are trying really hard to only think in one specific way. I'm going to walk through what the hats are, and then we'll give some examples of how you would use these. So right now, as I'm explaining this to you, and I'm explaining the high-level ideas of how 6 thinking hats work, I'm wearing the blue hat. This is blue hat thinking because I'm looking at the bigger picture, I'm looking at the process, I'm talking about the high-level guidelines of what we're talking about. This is all blue hat thinking. We tend to start and end our exercises with blue hat. So I set the rules, I lay out the ideas, and when we get to the end, we come back together. If we were using this as a retrospective technique, for example, I would use blue hat thinking again to bring everybody back to a point where we can get some action items. Then if I take the blue hat off and I put the white hat on, now I'm thinking about just data. What do I know? What specific things do I know about the situation at hand? So for example, if I was using this on a retro on the fact that we're now all working remotely, we're all working from home, which is an unusual thing for us, for most of us. White hat, when I'm wearing that, I might say things like, we're all in our homes. That's a fact. I'm having to use home internet connections, which are not necessarily stable. That's a fact. I have communicating with people is more challenging because I'm restricted to video and text. That's a fact. So what are the raw facts? I might say we have certain percentages of things. So this percentage of people have these tools installed, and this percentage of people have those things installed. These are all facts. So we don't care that I can't say something like everybody is upset because that's not a fact. I can say that specific people are upset. I can say I'm upset. I could say that Trish is upset based on things that she might have said to me. But I can't just generically say everybody's upset because that's not data. That's an interpretation of data. So white hat is all about the facts. What do I know? When I take the white hat off, I might put on the red hat. And the red hat is all about feelings. I feel that people are upset about this. I feel angry because I'm locked up in my house. I'm upset. I'm worried about people around me. There's all kinds of, how do we feel about things? And they may well be related to the things in the white hat, but the red hat is all about feeling. So when I'm wearing the red hat, I'm thinking specifically about how things feel. Hunches, intuition, etc. Then when I take the red hat off and I put the green hat on, and the green hat is creativity. So we may already have a way to do the thing we're doing. For example, in a remote situation, we're all relying on video conferencing, or most of us are. So with green hat, I might say, what's another way of communicating? I already have one, I have green hat. What's another way? Oh, perhaps we could also use text. Perhaps we could also use a different tool. Perhaps we could also do this. And what if we did this? And what if we did that? Green hat is all about creativity. We often layer constraints in when we're talking about green hat. So we might say, I have a way to do video, but the way we're using right now is actually quite expensive. So could we find a way of doing the same thing, but at lower cost? That's a constraint that we would put around the green hat thinking. Then I can take off the green hat and I can put on the yellow hat. The yellow hat is all about positivity. And it might seem as a strange thing to mix in with what we're talking about, but as humans, we are wired for negativity. Through millions of years of evolution, those of us who were negative, who anticipated dangers, were the ones that survived. The ones that were all happy-go-lucky got eaten by the saber-toothed tigers. So yellow hat forces us to think about the positive. So even though we're at home, there must be some situation. Well, I see my family more often. That's a positive thing. I'm hoping it's positive for most of you. Anyway, so when we're wearing the yellow hat, we're very specifically looking for the positivity, which for some people comes naturally and for others does not. The black hat, is the last one, is all about judgment. It's risk. If we do this thing, there are these risks associated with it. Many people tend to lean towards black hat thinking a lot. So you'll get into a retrospective and somebody will throw an idea up and somebody else will say, it would never work. That's black hat thinking, would never work. Or there's too much risk, or it's too expensive, or we can't do it for this reason. That's all black hat thinking. And there's a time and a place for black hat thinking. And when we are doing our normal creativity process, we tend to do it too much of the black hat, because again, we're wired for negativity. So now that we've walked through the six, the idea is that as we are doing this in a brainstorming exercise, and this could be something like we're trying to brainstorm strategic direction for the company, we're doing a retrospective for a team, we're doing some product planning, anything that requires some creativity, we put on one hat at a time and everybody at the table thinks with the same hat. So when we are wearing white hat, the only ideas that are permissible are data ideas. When we're wearing the yellow hat, we're not asking for risk. Everybody must talk about the yellow, the positivity. When we do this as a team, we very explicitly want everybody wearing the same hat at the same time. There's always a tendency for somebody to say, oh, yes, I know most of the team's wearing yellow, but I have a black hat idea. I want to tell you why that can't work. And we don't want to do that. The power of the technique is forcing us to only look at one perspective at a time and to cycle through them. So cycling through is the next thing. As I've mentioned, we usually start and end with the blue hat. We are not required to go through all the hats, but we typically do. It is allowed to move backwards through the hats. So we could say, perhaps I started with the white hat. I tend to live in my head, so I like to start with white hat, but there's no single right one to start with. I might start with the white hat and lay out some data. I might say, here's some things I know. And then we as a whole team might switch to red hat and say, oh, okay, here's how I feel about these things that we just put down on the table for data. But then somebody says, oh, well, there's more data. Okay, let's all of us as a group take off the red hat and put the white hat back on. So the key is that we are all thinking through the same lens at the same time. And this forces us into really interesting and creative approaches. Edward de Bono, who came up with this, his whole life's work was all about engendering more creativity, getting creativity for all aspects of work. And this is one of the techniques that he's done. He actually has a number of other techniques as well. Lateral thinking, there's something about shoes that I'm drawing a blank on what the exact name is, but there's a bunch of different techniques he has. This is a really, really simple one that is incredibly powerful. So how would I use this? In a retrospective, for example, retrospectives, we start off, we brainstorm, we come up with all kinds of ideas. But in a 6 Thinking Hats retrospective, we would walk through the hats one at a time. So I would say to the team, what hat do you want to start with? And they might say, we want to start with yellow. Let's look at the good, the positive. Okay, so as a group, we all go through the yellow. And when I notice that the ideas are slowing down, I might say, okay, now what hat should we switch to? And everybody switches to that other hat at the same time. So it might be red, or we might go to black, or we might go to green. It doesn't really matter which order we go in. My tendency is to do black last, simply because we're all hardwired for that. The one trick as a facilitator is that you have to make sure that everybody follows the same hat, because inevitably there will be that one person who wants to wear nothing but the black hat or nothing but the red hat, because people are wired that way. We have an inclination where we all lean more towards one of the hats than we do to the others. And the power of the exercise is to ensure that we are looking through all possible lenses. So if I were laying this out on a table, it's a little bit harder now that we're all remote. But if I was doing this in a retrospective, I would have different color sticky notes. It is possible, by the way, to get black sticky notes. Amazon sells them. The gotcha with those is that you need to be writing in a Sharpie color that is not black. The silver ones work really well. So I will take a whole bunch of pads of paper of all the 6 different colors. We start as a group, let's do white. So we write on the white sticky notes, we put them down on the table. Then perhaps we do red next. We put red ones down on the table as well. If they relate to the white ones, we put them on top. If they're just, I was mad about something, but it's not related to a specific piece of data, I put it off to the side. Once we've collected all of the data, now we go through our standard retrospective techniques of we've brainstormed everything. Now we cluster them, we condense them down, we pick some actions and move forward. So that's how I would use it in a retro. It's the same approach if I'm doing product planning or if I am doing strategic direction. Anything that requires creativity, we can cycle through the 6 Thinking Hats model. So that's it at a high level. Now let's look at what questions you might have.
Well, you answered one of the ones that I was thinking of, which was the sticky notes are a great idea. I was picturing the actual hats, but the sticky notes mean you can actually write on them, which would be tricky with hats.
I've tried to get little party hats, but I've not been able to find them cheap enough, and I didn't want to spend a lot of money on a gimmick.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to point out, Jeff made the point that your illustrations are actually incorrect. Those are top hats. They should be bowler hats.
Yeah. I accept that feedback.
Right. File that wherever you please. So a question that came up is, how do you synthesize the information once you've collected it on the Post-it notes?
Well, in the case of a retro, it's the standard retro techniques that I would do. So once we've got the ideas out, I would cluster them to make sure we remove duplicates, cluster them up appropriately, and then dot vote, which would be my standard approach. So I'm only using the thinking hats during the brainstorming phase. And then everything else I would do just as a standard retro. So let's cluster, let's dot vote, let's pick some actions, and we go forward.
Right.
If we were doing more strategic planning, when we lay them all out, often just by stepping back, even if you can't see the actual writing on the stickies, you'll see patterns in the data from this one white sticky has a lot of red clustered around it. So there was a lot of emotion there. So you can start to see patterns in the data, and you can make determinations just by looking at, by stepping back and looking at it.
Another question here. Maybe you could share your thoughts about using the 6 Thinking Hats for doing root cause analysis.
I haven't yet, but I absolutely see that you could.
Okay.
You know, white hat, what do we know? Oh, red, how do you feel about that? Oh, we're embarrassed that it happened.
Do you have any anecdotes, I guess, stories about using this technique that have been particularly interesting, or I don't know, just that would kind of set the tone a little bit.
Well, let me talk about one of my mistakes. I did this
Okay.
at a company where we had 10, I think it was 10 tables of 10 people each doing thinking hats. And I naively thought that I could sort of facilitate around all the tables. And I found that some tables were doing it right and some tables were going off in totally wrong directions. And so now I insist on having a facilitator per table to make sure that they don't go way off track.
Right.
But they ended up, that was a case where the company had identified a large number of strategic things that they wanted to tackle. So they sent surveys out across the entire company and said, what are the problems that we as a company are facing? And they brought 100 or so of these people into a room. We did the 6 thinking hats exercise across these problems. Every table had a different problem. And it was, let's brainstorm these ideas, let's come up with solutions. They proposed some experiments, and then after I left them, they were going to go and implement those experiments across the company.
Mm-hmm. What about,
I've also used it a lot with retros. And
you, I mean, one of the key things here, which I found interesting, is that you are trying to keep everybody in that same mindset and focused on the particular color of hat. How do you keep people from jumping to a new hat, from kind of switching it up in midstream? What have you found is effective in that context?
And this is where there's no right answer. If I feel that the group is ready to switch hats anyway, I'll say, that's a great red hat question, or that's a great green hat. Let's all switch to green so we can talk about that. Or if I feel that there's still a lot on the previous color, I'll say, hold that one. Now's not the right time. We'll get to that color.
Right.
But it's very subjective if I feel that the group is ready to switch colors or not.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Got a question here from Martin. Beyond retrospectives, are certain hat combinations a good fit for different types of meetings?
It's not so much certain combinations. I tend to ask the team, where do you want to start? Where do you want to go next? It's okay to cycle back to previous ones. And it's any place that you need creativity. So for myself, working with a lot of agile teams, it tends to be retros, product planning, strategic roadmaps. But if you were doing, long-term strategic visioning, like I did with this company, let's solve some real problems we've got. Any area you use creativity, just cycle through a lot of things. And there is no wrong place to start, no wrong place to end.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. Have you tried having specific people wear specific hats and provide the perspective of that hat rather than everyone doing the same thing at once?
I've had people try to convince me that they should be allowed to wear a hat for the whole time. And I've not allowed that, because then those people just get locked in a certain viewpoint. And we want everybody to be able to see it, because we can all wear all the hats, but some of the hats feel very uncomfortable. Right. So for people that are deeply black hat thinkers, yellow is an uncomfortable place to be. And so I want everybody to get into the ones they're comfortable with, but also get into the ones that they're not comfortable with, because we're trying to get new ideas. We're trying to get as much creativity as we can out of the whole group.
So do you typically cycle through all 6 of the hats? Is that the most effective way to do it, or do you sometimes limit it?
No, it's unless we're blocked for time, I will cycle through all of them. And often we will cycle back through previous ones again. So we'd already been to white, we got into green and realized that there was more data that we knew, so we'll go back to white.
Right.
Or we get over to black and we recognize that we just blew away all of our options. Let's go back and brainstorm some more. Let's go back up to green, get some more creativity.
Jeff raises an interesting point here. Color blindness. So from an accessibility perspective, are there concerns about if people are at the table who have a form of color blindness and can't distinguish the colors of the hats, will they feel discriminated against?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question, and I haven't hit that yet.
Okay.
If there's anybody here who is colorblind who would have an opinion on that, please jump in.
So I guess there's a couple of questions related to time. So specifically time boxing hats. I guess does that depend on the available time, or do you kind of have a rule of thumb around that?
Well, with anything creative, I don't want to make the time too short. So if, for example, if I'm doing a retrospective, I never book less than 2 hours anyway, because I want to make sure that we have enough time to get through all the conversation we need. Sometimes I've been asked to do this in a short period of time. You've only got half an hour. What can you do? Well, we're probably not going to be able to get through all the hats, but let's see what we can do. See as far as we can get.
Right. Another question here. How might one facilitate this through a change canvas?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure the relationship between this and the change canvas, other than the change canvas is trying to give us some constraints so that we can come up with creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So we could apply those things towards green hat thinking, perhaps. I don't know. Interesting question.
Is there, have you seen emerging when you do these sessions a particular sequence of colors with the hats that is particularly effective in kind of eliciting the feedback from the team?
For many teams, starting with data, then going to emotion, so white, then red, and then ending up with black at the end, tends to be an effective pattern for a lot of teams. But some teams, they want to go straight to green, or they want to go straight to yellow. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right. I have, let's see. Dan's question kind of goes back to mine. Can you tell us about the most amazing outcome or finding that you've gotten using this technique?
The most amazing. That's interesting. I've been surprised at the number of the conversations. Unfortunately, every time I've done it, I've been under NDA. So I can't give specific company-based values, but it was just generally I've been surprised at ideas that people came up with that they didn't think they would have come up with had we just opened it up and said, what do you think? So it forced ideas to come to the surface that they might not otherwise have done. But having said that, I also do a lot of techniques that do similar things like Lego Serious Play. So it's not that surprising to me to get interesting creativity.
Mm-hmm. Good. Now, some comments. Have you applied it to product planning?
Within a team, yes. So looking at a team plan going forward, and with the one company that I mentioned that was trying to solve big strategic problems. So yes, in those contexts. Right. Where I use it most is in retros, but I have used it in other contexts.
Right. Any suggestion for setting the stage for a retro to help people understand the concept and where they're going with it?
I tend to give the analogy, just as I did here, about putting on different hats. You know, I'm gonna step over here and put on my sales hat. I'm gonna take that off and I'll put my customer hat on, because this is common language. We all talk like this. Everybody understands instinctively what that is. So I tend to use that analogy every time, and then I give the explanation of what the hats are. I do tend to put a poster on the wall when we're doing it, because everybody forgets what the colors are. So a big poster up on the wall with all of the descriptions of what I just showed you. And then we go from there.
Right, makes sense. And retrospectives aside, have you used this for sort of straight up brainstorming for problem solving?
Beyond the cases I've talked about, no.
Okay. Let's see. As a facilitator, do you cycle through the various techniques, or stick to the ones that work well? Are there different techniques you use?
Different technique. I'm not sure where we're going with this, because I just consider this a technique.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't use this all the time. I would certainly never, just with any kind of a brainstorming or retrospective technique, I'm not going to do the same technique repeatedly, because doing it repeatedly gets you into the same path all the time. There is actual neuroscience research showing that to get the higher levels of creativity, we need novelty. Because when we get novelty, our brains generate a hormone whose name escapes me at the moment that helps with creativity. So we need that novelty. We also need a bit of fun to get real creativity going. So I would not be doing the same technique twice. If I've done 6 thinking hats with a team, I'm probably not going to do it again for several months. But then I'll bring something else in that's also creative and novel and interesting.
Yeah. So we're just about at half past. So maybe we'll stop there. And yeah, really appreciate it, Mike. That was great.
Oh, thank you.
And I guess at this point, I'll pass it back to Trish to sort of carry us over into the next phase of the evening.
That's it. So thank you, Mike. That was fantastic. Lots of great questions as well. Before we end, 2 things. Remember, please provide feedback. This helps us to deliver really fabulous things for the Agile community. And the link is in the chat, not the Q&A. And a big shout out now to Squirrel North, Martin, for providing this webinar Zoom tool. We usually use Zoom Pro, but he let us use this tonight to test out, and it's working. It's pretty amazing. So thank you, Martin. We appreciate it.
Nice.
So other than that, I bid you all a good evening and a COVID-free week. And you too, Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you.